The first time Damien Cross placed my future on the line, it was not in a dramatic courtroom or a smoky bar filled with whispers. It was in a brightly lit conference room, the kind designed to look modern but always felt sterile and hollow. The air conditioner hummed above us with mechanical precision, and the blinds were drawn halfway to block the sunlight. The walls were white, the table polished glass, and everything about the space screamed control. His control. I sat at one end of the table. Damien, tall and sharp in his tailored suit, stood at the other. Between us lay a single sheet of paper. Ordinary at first glance, deadly if I surrendered to it, my resignation letter. "Sign this now," Damien said softly, his words pressed down like weights. "If you refuse, I will make sure you never work in this industry again." The threat was not new. He had been tightening the noose around me for weeks, perhaps months. But something about the way he said it, the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the paper as though it were already mine, told me this was the climax of his game. The paper bore 3 neat paragraphs, all company standard. The most important line, though, was the one near the top. Voluntary resignation. My eyes caught on those words, and the room around me seemed to shrink. The glass walls reflected back a version of myself I barely recognized, a woman trapped between compliance and ruin. I felt my chest constrict, the way it does when panic wants to rise, but I did not let it surface. Not in front of him. Not here. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to hold still, to project calm. I had learned long ago that silence could be more dangerous than fury, and Damien was the kind of man who expected the women around him to break. He leaned forward, waiting for my collapse. His expression was smug, as if he were already rehearsing the story he would tell the board about how I had chosen to leave quietly. He believed in inevitability. He believed the system was his weapon. What he did not know was that I had been preparing for this exact moment. The truth is, preparation begins long before the war is declared. Weeks earlier, when the first small cracks appeared in the numbers, I started to suspect something was wrong. And when those suspicions led me to a trail of irregular transactions, I understood that survival would not come from instinct alone. It would come from knowledge. Knowledge of law, of language, of the company's processes, and most importantly of people like Damien. I stared at the paper in front of me. Then, with steady hands, I lifted the pen. If you are expecting me to say my hands trembled, that I hesitated, that I felt powerless, I have to disappoint you. The truth is that by then, fear had calcified into something else. Determination, maybe, defiance, certainly. I did not tremble because I knew this paper was not my end. It was his beginning. I signed. My handwriting flowed across the page in precise strokes. But before my signature touched the line, I made a single adjustment. Just one. A small change, a substitution of words that Damien would never notice in his arrogance. When I slid the paper back toward him, he did not read it. Of course he didn't. Men like Damien never imagine they need to check. He believed he had already won. His smile stretched thin across his face, victory written in the curve of his lips. "Clear your desk by the end of the day," he said. His tone was light, almost casual, like a man brushing dust off his sleeve. "Security will escort you out." I nodded once. "I will need this meeting documented for my records." For the first time, his smile slipped. Only slightly, but enough. His eyes flickered with something cold, a flash of irritation at the reminder that I was not just a pawn to be discarded without trace. "You will get the necessary paperwork from HR," he replied quickly. I rose from the chair. My bag was light in my hand, but my heart was heavy and quick, pounding against my ribs. Still, my face remained calm, the mask of composure intact. As I walked past the glass door, the security guard outside shifted uncomfortably. His gaze met mine for half a second, and in that half second I saw something almost like sympathy. He did not speak. He could not. But he looked at me as though he understood that what had happened inside was not as simple as Damien believed. The corridor was bright under fluorescent lights, and the reflection of my face in the polished wall panels startled me. I looked calm, composed, maybe even indifferent, but inside, I knew what I had just done. I had taken the weapon Damien had pressed into my hand and twisted it ever so slightly until it pointed back at him. If you are wondering why I seemed so calm, let me explain. Sometimes rebellion does not come with shouting. Sometimes it does not look like defiance. Sometimes rebellion is a pen pressed to paper, a word altered, a signature that carries a different meaning than the one expected. That was the moment I chose to fight, not by raising my voice, not by pleading or begging, but by writing myself into the story he thought he controlled. When I left the room, Damien believed he had destroyed me. What he could not see was that I had already laid the first stone of his undoing. And so begins my story. I did not walk straight out of the building. That would have been too easy, too obvious, and besides, I was not finished yet. I needed to breathe, to let the adrenaline find its way through my system, but I also needed to think. Every move from now on had to matter. The hallway stretched before me, lined with framed motivational quotes and photographs of city skylines. Words like integrity, progress, excellence stared back at me in glossy type. I had walked past them hundreds of times before without thinking. Now they seemed like cruel jokes, empty reminders of the promises this company had betrayed long before today. I slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The mirror reflected a woman who looked strangely composed, even as her pulse raced beneath the skin. My dark hair was pulled back neatly, my blouse crisp, my makeup still intact. From the outside, there was no trace of what had just happened. That, I realized, was an advantage. Damien thought I was broken. Everyone else would think the same. But the truth was hidden, and for once, the truth was mine alone. I pressed both palms against the counter and closed my eyes. My father used to tell me that panic is a choice. You can let it take you, or you can breathe through it until it shrinks into something manageable. He was not a man who had ever worked in high-rise towers or glass offices. He owned a small repair shop, tinkering with wires and circuit boards, yet he knew how systems fail, how one loose connection can bring down an entire machine. I carried that lesson with me now. My phone buzzed in my bag. For a moment I thought it might be Damien, already second-guessing what he had done. But when I pulled it out, the screen showed an unfamiliar number. I did not answer. Not yet. I had my own calls to make first. I opened my encrypted folder. Every document I had collected over the past months was there, neatly arranged by date, labeled with care. Screenshots of emails, copies of invoices, spreadsheets with highlighted discrepancies. I scrolled through them slowly, reassuring myself that I had not imagined it, that the trail was real and undeniable. This was my safety net, the proof that would protect me when the storm broke open. After a few minutes, I washed my hands, straightened my blouse, and left the bathroom. The guard was still stationed by the door of the conference room, but he avoided my gaze. He looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. I gave him a small nod as I walked past. It was not his fight. The elevator ride to my floor felt endless. I clutched my bag tightly, forcing myself to focus on each passing second instead of the uncertainty ahead. The doors slid open to the familiar hum of keyboards and the low murmur of voices. Heads turned toward me, then quickly away again. Word traveled fast in offices like this. They all knew something had happened, even if they did not know what. I reached my desk, a neat corner filled with color-coded files and a small plant that leaned toward the artificial light. For years, this space had been the center of my world. Late nights, early mornings, coffee stains hidden beneath stacks of paper. Now I looked at it and felt nothing. This was no longer a workplace. It was a battlefield, and I had already chosen my side. I began packing my things methodically. A framed photo, a notebook, a set of pens, not much, really. I had always kept my life simple, perhaps because I never wanted to give this company more of myself than I could afford to lose. Still, each item carried memories of hours I had poured into this place. Hours they were willing to erase with one signature. Theo passed by, hesitating near my desk. His expression was troubled, but he said nothing. Not yet. I could see the questions in his eyes, though, and I knew I had planted a seed earlier when I whispered for him to check certain files. Seeds take time, and time was exactly what I had forced open with that single altered word. By the time the guard returned to escort me, my box was ready. He picked it up without asking, his large hands almost gentle as he carried it for me. As we walked toward the lobby, he leaned slightly closer and spoke in a voice so low I barely caught it. "I'm sorry about this, Miss Fox. It never made sense to me why they would let go of someone like you." I felt a knot tighten in my chest, but I managed a small smile. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." In the lobby, the marble floor gleamed under bright lights, and the revolving doors spun endlessly as people came and went. I paused at the threshold, my box in the guard's hands, my bag slung over my shoulder. For a moment, doubt flickered. What if I had made a mistake? What if this single choice left me with nothing? But then I remembered Damien's face as he smiled without reading the page. I remembered the arrogance, the certainty, the blindness of a man who believed he could not be touched. And I knew without question that I had not made a mistake. I had set a trap, and he had stepped into it willingly. Outside, the city air hit me like a wave, thick with exhaust and the faint smell of rain. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight in my chest ease just a little. The sky above was gray, clouds heavy and low, but I had never felt more alive. That night, I did not sleep. I sat on my balcony with the box beside me, its contents scattered across the table. My laptop glowed in the dark, spreadsheets open, folders lined up like soldiers. The city stretched out before me, windows shining like a constellation of possibilities. I thought about everything that had led me here, every small detail I had noticed, every time I had bitten back a question, every hour I had spent tracing lines of numbers until dawn. I thought about the risks, about how easily this could still collapse. But above all, I thought about the word I had changed, the word that turned a resignation into a weapon. That word was my shield now, and soon it would be my sword. Preparation does not begin in moments of crisis. It begins quietly, in the unnoticed hours when no one is watching. Long before Damien slid that paper across the table, I had already begun to build my defense. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because I recognized the patterns that told me something was coming. It started with numbers, as it always does for me. Numbers have a way of speaking to those who are patient enough to listen. They tell stories, reveal secrets, and refuse to lie. One late evening, long after most of my colleagues had left, I sat at my desk tracing transactions through the company's financial reports. At first, it was nothing more than a small inconsistency, an amount shifted from one budget line to another without the proper authorization. Most people would not have noticed. Most people would have shrugged it off as a clerical error. But I am not most people. I stared at the line of figures glowing on my screen and felt a familiar itch at the back of my mind. Something did not fit. I pulled older reports, cross-referenced them, and highlighted every irregularity. Patterns began to emerge. Transfers repeated every quarter, small but precise, always linked to projects connected to Damien's department. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this was no accident. The first time I brought it up to Damien, I did it cautiously. I placed the documents on his desk during one of our one-on-one meetings. His office was always immaculate, the kind of space that tells you everything is under control. I waited while he skimmed the highlighted pages. "These are already approved by accounting," he said dismissively, sliding the papers back toward me without a second glance. "Approved, yes," I replied evenly, "but the authorization chain is incomplete. These transfers don't have the required signatures. That is a violation of policy." His eyes met mine then, and for the first time I saw the coldness behind his carefully polished charm. "Drop it, Callie. This isn't your concern." That was the moment I knew. Not because of the irregularities themselves, but because of his reaction. Innocent mistakes invite clarification, not hostility. His tone carried a warning, sharp and deliberate. I walked out of his office that day with my heart pounding. But instead of stopping, I began documenting everything. I created a secure folder on my personal drive, encrypted and hidden under layers of passwords. Every night I copied emails, downloaded spreadsheets, and photographed printed documents. I logged dates, times, and conversations, down to the exact wording. I did not know yet what I was building, but I knew I would need it. The tension escalated gradually, like a string pulled tighter each day. My name began disappearing from project credits. Reports I had written were suddenly presented by others, with Damien praising them as if they were their own work. Meetings I once attended were held without me. My colleagues told me I was overreacting, that Damien was demanding with everyone, but I knew the difference. His pressure was deliberate, targeted. I started noticing other small signs. My access to certain files was restricted without explanation. My performance review, once glowing, suddenly mentioned vague issues with teamwork and communication. Assignments given to me carried impossible deadlines. It was not incompetence on his part. It was strategy. He was building a case against me, preparing the ground for what would eventually become that resignation letter. I was not entirely alone, though at the time I felt like I was. Theo, a colleague from my team, sometimes gave me sympathetic looks. Once over coffee, he said quietly, "You are making yourself a target, Callie. Be careful." He meant it as concern, but it sounded like resignation. Most people in offices like ours learn quickly that survival depends on silence. I refused to accept that. At night, when the city outside my apartment settled into its restless rhythm, I studied employment law. I read cases of constructive dismissal, of hostile work environments, of whistleblowers who had fought and lost, and a few who had fought and won. The patterns were as clear as the numbers in my spreadsheets. Companies protect themselves first. They count on employees being too afraid, too underprepared to resist. but fear is only power when it remains unchallenged. I met Alina Ward in a quiet cafe not far from the office. She was sharp-eyed, dressed in gray, with a voice that carried both warmth and steel. I slid the folder of evidence across the table, my hands shaking just slightly for the first time in weeks. She read in silence, her fingers tracing the pages, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up. "This is textbook hostile environment," she said. "You have documentation, a clear pattern, and evidence of retaliation. But you need to understand what you're stepping into. These cases are exhausting. They will try to break you down until you walk away. Even if you win, you will not come out unscathed." "So what do you suggest?" I asked. She tapped the folder. "If they want you gone, make them pay for it. With this much evidence, a settlement is possible. But be prepared. They might try to force a resignation first." I almost laughed then. The irony was sharp enough to sting. I already knew Damien would try exactly that. The only question was when. From that day, I doubled my efforts. I installed a recording app on my phone. I forwarded key emails to a private account. I built a timeline that connected every irregular transaction to shifts in performance bonuses and suspicious vendor contracts. I left nothing to chance. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. One evening, while cross-checking vendor payments, I noticed something unusual. Some of the transfers did not trace back to Damien's direct approvals. They carried higher-level authorizations, signatures I recognized from the executive suite. At first, I thought it might be coincidence, an error in the system. But the more I dug, the more I saw that the trail did not end with Damien. That realization stopped me cold. If Damien was not acting alone, if someone above him was involved, then I was not just facing one ruthless manager. I was brushing against something far larger, far more dangerous. Still, I kept digging. The more I uncovered, the more careful I became. Discovery was not enough. I needed strategy. Information without timing is just noise, and timing was everything. Damien was skilled at appearances. In front of the board, he was a visionary, a man who spoke in grand statements about growth and innovation. He could charm a room without breaking a sweat. In private, though, his tone was sharp, cutting, designed to make you feel smaller each time you questioned him. I learned to record those conversations discreetly, slipping my phone onto the desk with the microphone active. His words, once ephemeral, became evidence. Each time I left his office, I transcribed the details immediately. The dates, the times, the exact phrasing. I treated it like data because in a way that is exactly what it was. People lie. Patterns do not. Of course, he noticed that I was not bending as easily as he wanted. The retaliation grew more creative. Invitations to important meetings vanished from my calendar without explanation. Team lunches were scheduled during my recurring therapy appointments, the ones I never hid. Colleagues began to look at me differently, their smiles a little too forced, their conversations quieting when I walked into a room. He was isolating me, one thread at a time, until I was left standing alone. Loneliness can be dangerous. It can make you question your own reality. There were nights when I stared at the ceiling in my dark apartment and wondered if I was imagining everything. Was I paranoid? Was I making patterns where none existed? But then I would open my files, trace the numbers again, listen to the recordings of his voice, and the doubt would evaporate. The truth was written clearly enough for anyone who cared to look. Still, it wore me down. I lost weight without meaning to. My sleep became shallow, fragmented. Friends outside of work stopped inviting me out because my excuses were always the same. Too tired, too busy, too much on my mind. My world narrowed to spreadsheets, documents, and the constant hum of vigilance. And yet, a strange thing happened. The more he pushed me, the sharper I became. It was as if the pressure crystallized something inside me, turning fear into focus. Every insult, every unfair review, every closed door added to my determination. If Damien wanted me silent, then silence was the one thing I would never give him. Alina kept reminding me to pace myself. Over coffee one evening, she leaned forward and said, "You cannot win this in a single strike, Callie. You win by building a case so solid they cannot shake it, no matter how hard they try." Her words anchored me. I was not just gathering scraps anymore. I was building an unbreakable wall. I upgraded my security, too. Encrypted backups of my files were stored in cloud services under aliases. Physical copies were hidden in a locked drawer in my apartment. I even kept a set with a trusted friend outside the city, just in case. I had read enough about whistleblowers to know how quickly evidence can vanish when systems are compromised. One night, close to midnight, I stared at a sequence of transfers that chilled me. The vendor payments I had traced earlier showed not just inflated contracts, but links to subsidiaries with shell company structures. And some of the approvals bore the initials of one of the company's executives. I sat back in my chair, the city lights glowing beyond the window, and felt a surge of clarity. Damien was not the architect of all this. He was an operator. Someone higher had given him permission. That was when fear returned, sharper than before. Facing Damien was one thing. He was arrogant, reckless, convinced of his invincibility. But whoever stood above him was smarter, quieter, hidden. That kind of power was harder to expose. I did not know it then, but this was the first hint of the twist that would later turn everything upside down. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my desk relocated. Without explanation, it had moved my workstation to a dim corner near the server room. The noise of the machines was constant, a dull roar that made conversation nearly impossible. It was isolation disguised as logistics, another deliberate cut to push me further away. When I questioned the move, Damien smiled pleasantly and said, "It's for efficiency. I thought you would appreciate being closer to the data." I wanted to laugh at the audacity, but I said nothing. Silence can be more dangerous than protest, and he mistook mine for surrender. The truth was, every new slight gave me more ammunition. Each action went into my log, each conversation captured, each irregularity documented. He was building his case, but I was building mine faster. Sometimes I thought of my father again, hunched over circuit boards in his shop. He used to say, "The smallest connection can decide whether the whole system works or fails." I had taken that to heart. Damien thought he was tightening the screws, but in reality he was loosening them, creating fractures that I would one day use against him. I also thought about the younger version of myself, the girl who had color-coded her notebooks, who had learned to see patterns in chaos, who had never been satisfied with half answers. That girl had not disappeared. She had simply grown sharper, harder, more willing to confront the shadows that others avoided. By the time Damien scheduled the meeting that would lead to the resignation letter, I was ready. I did not know the exact moment it would happen, but I had prepared for every possibility. My folder was complete, my files secured, my mind clear. So when I walked into that glass-walled conference room and saw the resignation paper waiting for me, I did not crumble. I was not surprised. I had been waiting for it. What Damien thought was the end of my story was only the beginning. I used to believe that courage was a solitary act. You stand alone, you hold your ground, you refuse to bend. But courage is never truly solitary. It spreads quietly, sometimes invisibly, through the smallest gestures of those who choose not to look away. In the days after Damien began to isolate me, I started to notice cracks in the silence around me. Theo was the first. He was not bold, not the kind of man who would openly defy a superior, but he had a conscience that made him restless. I saw it in the way he lingered by my desk, the hesitation in his eyes, the quick glances that suggested he wanted to speak but was afraid to be overheard. One evening, after most people had left, he approached me while I was packing up. "You know," he said softly, "the projections you built for the procurement model, they were brilliant. Everyone knows it was your work." It was a small comment, almost meaningless on the surface, but I understood what he was really saying. He saw what was happening. He saw the theft of credit, the deliberate erasure. "Then why stay silent?" I asked him gently. His jaw tightened. "Because I have a mortgage, because I have 2 kids, because men like Damien don't just fire you, they bury you." I did not argue with him, I only nodded. He was right. The system thrived on fear, and fear thrived on silence. But still, that moment mattered. Even whispered truth is a kind of allyship. Later, Marian from operations found me in the break room. She was brisk and efficient, the kind of woman who kept her head down and her reports flawless. She glanced around to make sure no one else was near, then lowered her voice. "Be careful, Callie. I heard Damien has been in meetings with HR all week. He is building something against you." "I know," I replied. She looked startled. "You know?" "Yes," I said. "And so am I." Her eyes widened, then softened. She said nothing more, but she pressed a hand briefly against my arm before leaving. That fleeting contact told me enough. She believed me. She might not have been ready to act, but belief itself was a kind of rebellion. Elena remained my anchor outside of work. Every time I met her, she seemed sharper, more certain. We sat in quiet corners of cafes, papers spread between us, her pen tapping against her notes. "They are tightening the circle," she warned me. "You need to anticipate the next step." "I know what the next step is," I said. "He is going to try to force me out." She studied me for a long moment. "And you are ready for that?" I thought of the folder hidden in my apartment, the files duplicated and encrypted in places Damien would never reach. I thought of the recordings of his voice, the pattern of transactions, the signatures that hinted at someone higher pulling strings. I nodded. I am ready. What I did not tell her was that I had begun to suspect Damien was only the surface of the problem. Each time I traced a line in the spreadsheets, each time I uncovered another irregularity, I found signs that pointed upward. Not downward, not sideways, upward. Someone above him had to be enabling this. And if that was true, then I was already in deeper water than I realized. But suspicion is not proof. And proof is the only language that matters in a world built on contracts and liability. The hardest part of those weeks was not the retaliation. It was the isolation. People who had once been friendly now avoided my eyes in meetings. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. Invitations disappeared. Even casual lunches became rare. I felt like a ghost moving through the office, visible but unwanted. And yet, in that loneliness, the smallest gestures glowed like sparks in the dark. Theo slipping me a copy of a report Damien had tried to hide. Marion forwarding me a memo marked confidential that showed decisions had been made behind closed doors without proper oversight. A security guard named Lewis nodding to me with quiet respect when I left late at night. None of these actions were grand. But together, they reminded me that truth does not survive alone. It survives in fragments, in witnesses, in the courage of people who may never stand at the front, but still refuse to look away. At home, I built my case with the discipline of someone assembling a puzzle whose image only revealed itself piece by piece. My walls were covered in notes, timelines, cross-references. I mapped transactions against performance bonuses, linked vendor contracts to subsidiaries, highlighted names that appeared too often to be coincidence. I worked until my eyes blurred, until my head ached. It would have been easy to let exhaustion swallow me. But each time I felt the weight pressing down, I reminded myself of what Damien had said in his office. Drop it. This is not your concern. That was the line that fueled me, because it was my concern. Because when someone tells you to look away, what they are really saying is that they are afraid of what you will find. I did not know who my true allies would be yet, but I knew I was no longer entirely alone. Courage spreads quietly, like a whisper through a closed door, waiting for the right moment to become a shout. The cracks widened faster than I expected. Once you start noticing patterns, you cannot unsee them, and soon the silence of others began to carry its own kind of weight. Theo came to me again, late one evening when the office had thinned to a skeleton crew. His shoulders were tense, his eyes darting toward Damien's empty office as though the walls themselves might be listening. He set a flash drive on my desk and whispered, "I should not be giving you this. It is a backup of the last quarter's projections, the version before Damien edited them. Just be careful." My fingers closed over the drive. I could feel his hesitation, the way fear gnawed at him, but I also felt his decision. This was more than sympathy now, this was risk. "Thank you," I said softly. He shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. If anyone finds out, I could lose everything." I wanted to tell him that silence could cost more than speaking, but I knew better than to preach. Each person comes to their moment in their own time. Theo's moment had arrived quietly in the form of a flash drive left on my desk. That night at home, I opened the files. My heart pounded as I compared his version with the one Damien had presented. The differences were subtle but deliberate. Projections lowered in ways that disguised inflated costs, allocations shifted to hide overpayments to certain vendors. It was confirmation of what I already suspected, but confirmation has a power all its own. Suspicions can be dismissed. Proof cannot. Marion's help was quieter but no less valuable. She had access to internal scheduling documents, the kind that rarely left her department. One morning, she slipped me a folded paper on her way past the break room. Inside were notes about closed-door meetings between Damien and a senior executive, meetings never logged on the official calendar. When I traced the dates against the irregular transactions, the alignment was too precise to be coincidence. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Damien was not working alone. Someone higher was in the room with him, giving him cover. I carried this weight into my next meeting with Alina. We sat across from each other at our usual cafe, a quiet place with chipped tables and the smell of roasted beans lingering in the air. I spread the new documents between us, pointing to the patterns. She studied them in silence, her brow furrowed. Finally, she looked up. "This changes everything. Damien is dangerous, but he is small compared to whoever is above him. You have to be prepared for resistance from more than one front. I know, I admitted, and I do not know how far it goes. Elena tapped the papers with her pen. Then we build two cases, one against Damien directly to establish a clear hostile environment, and another against the larger pattern, the financial irregularities. If he falls, the one above him might stumble too. But you need to understand, Callie, this is going to get uglier before it gets better. I nodded. The truth rarely comes cheap. Back at the office, the atmosphere thickened. Conversations hushed when I approached, and I began to notice eyes following me more openly. Some of my colleagues looked at me with pity, others with fear, and a few with something like admiration. That last category was small, but it was there. People who had once avoided me now lingered just long enough to offer small kindnesses. A coffee left on my desk with no note. A warning glance when Damien entered the room. It was as if my quiet defiance had begun to stir something in them, something they had buried under years of submission. I did not fool myself into thinking they would all rise with me, but even the smallest shifts in behavior told me the silence was cracking. Louis, the security guard, became another unlikely ally. He worked long hours at the front desk, always polite, always professional. One evening, as I passed through the lobby, he leaned forward slightly and said, "I have seen a lot of people leave this building over the years. The ones who walk out with their heads down, they never come back. But you walk different. Keep walking that way." His words were simple, but they struck something deep inside me. I had been carrying the fight alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have someone believe in me, even in the smallest way. Despite these quiet allies, the pressure continued to build. Damien's tactics grew sharper. He began copying HR on every minor mistake he could fabricate, framing delays as incompetence, framing questions as insubordination. Each email was a brick laid carefully in the wall he thought he was building around me. What he did not know was that I was recording each brick, turning his own strategy into mine. Sometimes I wondered how much longer I could endure. My body felt the strain, my sleep thin and restless, my appetite dulled. There were mornings when I stared at my reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. But each time doubt tried to take hold, I returned to the same thought. He wanted me broken, and if I broke, he won. One evening, exhausted and restless, I pulled out the earliest documents I had collected. I traced the lines again, highlighting connections I had overlooked before. That was when I saw it. The timing of the transfers matched not just performance bonuses, but also announcements of new executive initiatives. The money was not just disappearing. It was being funneled into projects that benefited someone else at the top. I felt a chill as I sat back in my chair. Damien was the face of the manipulation, but he was not the mind behind it. That realization made everything more dangerous, but it also gave me clarity. If I wanted to survive, I needed more than proof against Damien. I needed to reveal the larger structure that allowed him to operate in the first place. I closed my laptop and stepped out onto my balcony. The city stretched out below me, restless and indifferent. I thought about how easy it would be to give in, to accept Damien's offer of quiet resignation and walk away. But then I thought about all the small voices that had reached me in the dark. Theo's flash drive, Marian's memo, Louis's words. Even Elena's steady hand across the table. I was not entirely alone anymore. The shadows were beginning to shift, and within them, allies were waiting. I understood then that courage might begin as a solitary act, but it grows through connection. And if Damien thought I was isolated, he had underestimated me once again, because the truth was spreading. And once truth begins to spread, it cannot be contained. The day after I signed Damien's resignation paper, I did not disappear. I did not vanish into silence as he expected. Instead, I walked into the building again, not as his subordinate but as something far more dangerous. A witness. Elena met me at a coffee shop across the street. She was already waiting when I arrived, her gray suit perfectly pressed, her briefcase resting at her side like a weapon. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "They are in panic mode," she said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. "I received 3 calls from their legal team last night. They want this to go away quietly, which means we already have leverage." I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle into me. "What is their angle?" "They will offer money," she said. "A settlement. They will ask for confidentiality for non-disparagement. They will paint Damien's behavior as an isolated incident, and they will expect you to take it because most people do." "Most people," I said quietly, "are not me." She smiled then, just slightly. Exactly, that is why we are here. At 8:57, we crossed the street together. My heels clicked against the pavement, steady, deliberate. When we entered the lobby, Lewis looked up from his desk and raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Back already, Miss Fox?" he asked softly, handing me a temporary badge. "Circumstances change," I said. He nodded. "That they do." The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like the slow ascent of a roller coaster, the anticipation heavy in the air. When the doors opened, the hallway buzzed with unusual activity. Assistants rushed past carrying stacks of files. Executives spoke in hushed voices behind closed doors. The company was bracing for something, though not yet sure what form it would take. We entered the main conference room. The long table gleamed under the lights, and at its head sat Aubrey Ravenholm herself, the founder and CEO. I had seen her many times in company meetings, admired her charisma and vision from afar. But this was the first time I saw her expression so controlled, her eyes sharp with calculation. To her right sat Pascal, the company's general counsel, and to her left the chief operating officer. Conspicuously absent was Damien. "Ms. Fox," Aubrey began, her tone professional, almost cold. "Thank you for joining us. We have reviewed your complaint and supporting documentation. The allegations you have raised are serious." "They are not allegations," I corrected quietly. "They are documented facts." The silence that followed was heavy. Pascal cleared his throat. "Beckworth Dynamics takes workplace conduct very seriously. If there have been violations of policy, we intend to address them appropriately." Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "If." "That is an interesting word, Mr. Pascal. My client's documentation speaks for itself. What we are here to determine is how the company chooses to respond." Aubrey raised a hand, silencing the tension in the room. "We are not disputing Ms. Fox's experiences. We are trying to understand the full scope of the situation." "The scope extends beyond my client," Elena said evenly. "We have reason to believe multiple employees have experienced similar treatment under Mr. Cross. And there is evidence of financial irregularities tied to his supervision that require immediate independent investigation." I watched Aubrey carefully. For a brief moment, her expression cracked. Genuine surprise flickered across her face, as though she had not expected the problem to stretch so wide. She turned to Imara, the HR director, who had been standing quietly near the wall. Imara gave a subtle nod, confirming that others had already come forward. Pascal shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "We have internal audit procedures in place, which failed to catch discrepancies for 2 years," I interrupted. My voice was calm, but inside I felt the tremor of adrenaline. "That suggests either negligence or complicity. Which is it?" The room fell into silence again. Aubrey studied me with new intensity, her gaze steady, weighing me not as a subordinate but as an equal adversary. "What exactly are you seeking, Ms. Fox?" she asked finally. Elena opened her portfolio and slid a paper across the table. "Full reinstatement with back pay from the date of constructive dismissal. A comprehensive independent investigation into both the hostile work environment and the financial irregularities. Accountability for all parties involved. And structural reforms to ensure this does not happen again." Pascal leaned back, frowning. "And if we counter with a settlement offer? Then we proceed with formal charges," Elena replied. "Which will trigger external audits and public disclosure. My client is not interested in being silenced." Aubrey's eyes returned to me. "And Damien Cross, what do you expect regarding his position?" I held her gaze. "That is for you to determine after a proper investigation, but I will not work under his supervision again." The meeting continued for another hour. We went back and forth through procedures, processes, potential outcomes. I remained silent most of the time, letting Elena speak for me. But each time I did speak, I made sure my words cut cleanly, leaving no room for dismissal. By the time we stood to leave, agreements had been set. I was formally reinstated with temporary reassignment to the executive analysis team, reporting directly to the COO. An independent investigative firm would arrive the next day, and Damien had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. It was not victory yet. But it was the beginning. As we walked out, Aubrey stopped us. "Ms. Fox, may I speak with you privately?" Elena glanced at me. I gave a small nod. When the door closed, Aubrey leaned against the table, her polished composure softening just slightly. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I built this company on the belief that we were better than the rest. Clearly, I missed what was happening under my own roof." "Hierarchies create blind spots," I replied, "even for good leaders." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "The financial discrepancies you identified, how extensive do you believe they are?" Significant enough to affect quarterly reports, I said. Systematic enough to suggest intentional manipulation, and patterned in ways that align with executive bonuses. Something hardened in her expression. She understood exactly what I meant. I did not wait for her reply. Instead, I asked, "Has Damien been informed of my reinstatement?" "He was notified of his administrative leave this morning," she said. "He does not yet know the full circumstances." I nodded. "Then tomorrow will be an interesting day." When I left the conference room that day, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt the weight of everything pressing harder than before. Survival was no longer my only goal. Now I was carrying the responsibility of proof, of consequences, of showing others that the silence could finally break. Theo was waiting near the elevators. The moment our eyes met, his lips curved into something between awe and disbelief. He leaned close as I approached and whispered, "You are terrifying in the best possible way." I almost laughed, but the tension in my chest was too thick. "Terrifying is good," I said softly. "It keeps people honest." He nodded, then glanced around. "They have locked down the finance servers Damien had access to. Everything with his initials is under review." I looked before they closed it off. "The patterns were obvious once you knew where to look. I made copies." "You did?" I felt a surge of gratitude. "Yes," he said. "I should have listened to you sooner. I am sorry." "What matters," I told him, "is that you looked eventually. Truth needs witnesses." The rest of that week blurred into long days and longer nights. The independent investigators arrived, setting up in a temporary office on the 12th floor. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the building. Hallways were filled with whispers, offices buzzing with speculation. Some employees avoided them, terrified of being dragged into the storm. Others walked in willingly, carrying years of frustration and buried complaints. I spent hours in interviews, walking the investigators through my files, explaining the patterns, connecting the dots. Each time I spoke, I felt stronger, as if my months of quiet preparation had finally found their purpose. But it was not only me anymore. Word spread quickly that others had come forward. By the end of the first week, I learned that 8 women and 3 men from different departments had reported inappropriate behavior from Damien. Stories of intimidation, credit theft, manipulative reviews. It was like a dam had cracked, releasing years of silence in a sudden flood. The realization hit me one afternoon as I returned to my desk. For so long, I thought I was fighting alone, but I never really was. Others had simply been waiting for someone to show that it was possible. Not everyone was ready to speak, though. Some colleagues still avoided me, their fear too ingrained, and I understood. Change is never universal, but I could see the shift in the air. Where there had been silence, there was now movement. Where there had been fear, there was the beginning of courage. Damien, meanwhile, had vanished. His office remained locked, his name absent from every meeting agenda. Rumors filled the gaps, that he was consulting lawyers, that he was furious, that he had been spotted leaving the building with boxes under his arm. I did not care which version was true. What mattered was that his power, once so absolute, had crumbled in an instant. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too soon. The investigation had already shown me something more troubling than Damien's arrogance. It revealed traces of signatures higher up, approvals that pointed to someone else in the executive circle. That was the shadow I could not ignore. One evening, Alina called me. Her voice was steady but low, as though she were speaking in a place where she did not want to be overheard. "The initial findings are strong," she said. "The investigators are circling not just Damien, but also the vendor contracts. They are seeing what you saw. But listen to me carefully, Callie. This goes higher, you must be prepared. They will protect themselves first, even if that means sacrificing him." "I know," I said. "I have seen enough already to know he is not the only one, but if the truth rises with him, then so be it." She paused. "That is exactly why they will fear you more than him. Do not forget that." Her words lingered long after the call ended. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it hides in smiles, in careful statements, in the way executives avoid direct answers. And I was beginning to sense that fear in places I had never expected. The following morning, Aubrey called an all-hands meeting. The cafeteria filled with employees, the air buzzing with anticipation. She stood at the front, her usual polished appearance slightly undone, as though the strain had begun to crack her armor. "I want to address the ongoing investigation directly," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "What began as a complaint of workplace conduct has uncovered financial irregularities that cannot be ignored. We have filed formal reports with the appropriate authorities." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Aubrey continued, her voice tightening. I take full responsibility for the failures that allowed this to happen. We will be implementing immediate changes to financial oversight, reporting structures, and employee protection channels. Most importantly, we will create systems where concerns can be raised without fear of retaliation. Her eyes swept the room and then landed on me. For a moment our gazes locked and I saw something I had not expected. Not anger, not defensiveness, gratitude. To those who spoke up, to those who refused to remain silent, I want to say thank you, she said. You have forced us to listen and you will make us better. The room erupted in low murmurs, but I felt only the stillness inside me. For months I had been isolated, diminished, erased. Now I stood in a room where the truth had found its voice. When the meeting ended, people who had avoided me for weeks approached my desk. Some apologized. Some simply asked questions. Others shared stories of their own silent struggles. For the first time in months, I felt less alone. But I also knew this was not the end. Damien was gone, but the shadow above him remained. The investigation would soon pull that into the light, and when it did, the confrontation would no longer be between me and one man. It would be between me and the system itself. As I left the building that evening, Lewis gave me a small salute from the security desk. I returned the gesture with a smile. Courage, I thought, is contagious, and once it spreads, there is no stopping it. I thought removing Damien would bring peace. For a moment, in the days that followed, I almost believed it. His absence was like a weight lifted from the office. Conversations flowed more freely, colleagues stopped avoiding my eyes, and the tense silence that had once followed me through the hallways began to dissolve. But peace is fragile, and illusions are even more fragile than that. The investigators were efficient, precise, almost surgical. They combed through reports, interviewed employees, traced transactions. Their presence was unsettling at first, but I grew accustomed to their questions. I knew what they were looking for, and I knew what they would find. What I did not expect was how quickly their search expanded beyond Damien. Within a week, whispers spread that they had discovered approvals carrying executive signatures. Not just Damien's initials, but authorizations that came from higher. Much higher. I first saw it myself one late evening when one of the investigators asked me to clarify a sequence of transfers. The document they showed me made my chest tight. The signature at the bottom did not belong to Damien. It belonged to someone else, someone who sat only one step below Aubrey herself. The discovery was like a crack spreading through glass. Damien was not the architect of this scheme. He was a shield, a distraction, a convenient villain. The real players were above him, hidden behind their polished reputations. That realization terrified me more than Damien ever had. He was arrogant, sloppy, easy to predict, but those above him. They had survived this long because they knew how to stay invisible. I brought my concerns to Alina. We met in her office this time, her desk stacked high with files. She listened without interrupting, her hands steepled under her chin. "So you finally see it," she said quietly. "You knew?" "I suspected," she admitted. Men like Damien rarely act alone. Someone allowed him to operate with impunity. Someone benefited from his manipulation. The question is not whether they exist. The question is how far up it goes. Her calmness both reassured me and unsettled me. "And if it goes all the way to the top," she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, "then you will have to decide what kind of war you are willing to fight. Because exposing a man like Damien is one thing, exposing the system that created him is another." Her words haunted me. For days I carried them in my chest like a stone. I had thought this battle was personal, a fight to reclaim my dignity, my career, my voice. But now it was something else entirely. Now it was about power. The first tangible shift came during an interview with the investigators. One of them, a man named Calder, slid a file across the table. His face was neutral, his tone carefully professional. "We would like your perspective on these," he said. I opened the folder and felt my breath catch. It contained contracts with vendor companies I had never seen before, subsidiaries tucked into obscure locations, their ownership chains tangled and opaque. But I recognized the signatures. "Who approved these?" I asked, though I already knew. Calder pointed to the line. "The authorization came from your chief financial officer, every single one." The room spun slightly. The CFO was a man I had only spoken to a handful of times, a quiet figure in board meetings who seemed more comfortable with numbers than people. He had always appeared distant, uninterested in office politics. And yet here was his name, tied directly to the very irregularities I had uncovered. I closed the folder carefully. You understand what this means, I said. Calder nodded. We do, which is why we are moving cautiously. Cautiously. That word chilled me. It meant the truth was bigger than they were ready to handle. At night, I returned to my apartment and spread the new documents across my table. I traced the lines, the dates, the signatures. Each one connected like a thread in a web, and at the center of that web was not Damien, but the CFO. And yet, the deeper I looked, the more I sensed even he might not be the end. There were too many alignments with executive bonuses, too many convenient approvals from multiple levels. He might have been the architect, but he was not the only one. The next morning, when I walked into the office, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. People greeted me now, some cautiously, some warmly. I was no longer invisible, but their eyes carried questions they were too afraid to ask aloud. They wanted to know how deep this went. They wanted to know if the company they had given their lives to was rotten at its core. In the break room, Theo caught me as I poured coffee. His face was pale, his voice urgent. Callie, they are saying the CFO is under review. Is it true? I hesitated, then nodded slightly. Yes, it is true. He stared at me, shaking his head slowly. God, if it is him, then nothing we thought we knew about this place is real. Maybe, I said softly, or maybe it is more real than ever. Maybe this is what it has always been. His silence was heavy. I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking it too. If corruption lived at the very top, then what hope did any of us have? But hope is not about certainty. It is about persistence. That night, as I looked out over the city lights, I remembered something my father used to say when one of his machines broke down. A system fails at its weakest link. Find the link and you can rebuild it stronger. The company was breaking. Cracks were spreading, and I had to decide whether to let it shatter or fight to rebuild. For the first time since this began, I felt both fear and power in equal measure. Fear because I was stepping into a battle far larger than I ever intended. Power because I now held the key to exposing it, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of the real fight. The first time I saw Damien after his suspension, it was not in the office. It was in the lobby of a downtown hotel, late in the evening when I stopped in to meet Alina for a strategy session. He was standing by the bar, his tie loosened, a glass in his hand. He saw me before I saw him. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and alive, and for the first time in weeks I realized he looked almost relieved. You did it, he said quietly when I passed close enough to hear him. You actually pulled the trigger. I stopped, every muscle tense. You have no idea what you're talking about. His smile was bitter. Oh, I have every idea. Do you think this was me? Do you think I built all of this? You are smarter than that, Callie. I wanted to walk away, but something in his tone made me pause. There was no arrogance this time, no sharp edge of dominance. There was only exhaustion. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because they are done with me now, he said. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes never leaving mine. I was useful until I was not, and now I am the perfect scapegoat. Everyone gets what they want. You get to be the hero. The company gets to pretend it cleaned itself, and the ones who actually built the machine keep walking free. His words lodged in my chest like splinters. Who are you talking about? He laughed softly, shaking his head. If you have not figured that out by now, then you are already too deep. I left him standing there, but his words followed me like shadows. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake replaying every file, every signature, every unexplained approval. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Damien was right. He had not built this. He had only served it. The next morning, the investigators called me in again. This time, the folder they placed before me carried more weight than any before. Inside were records of executive meetings, authorizations signed not only by the CFO but co-signed by the COO, and some bore Aubrey's initials. My chest tightened as I flipped through page after page. Each one was like a mirror shattering. I had admired Aubrey once, even respected her as the rare kind of leader who seemed untouchable, but the signatures were there. Clear. Indisputable. Where did you get these? I asked. The lead investigator, Calder, leaned forward. His voice was careful. We are still tracing the chain of custody, but you should understand, Ms. Fox, if these are authentic, they implicate more than just Damien. They implicate the very structure of leadership here. The room seemed to tilt. I steadied myself against the table. Are you saying Aubrey knew? Calder's eyes flickered. I am saying her name is on the documents. What she knew and when she knew it will determine the difference between complicity and negligence. But either way, this changes everything. Everything. The word rang in my ears like a warning. When I left that meeting, Theo was waiting in the hall. His face was pale, his voice urgent. Callie, they are saying the board is meeting in private sessions. No one knows what about, but people think it is connected to you. Of course it was. Everything now was connected to me. That evening, Alina came to my apartment. She spread the new documents across my kitchen table, her eyes scanning them with a growing frown. "This is not just about Damien anymore," she said. "This is systemic, and if these papers are real, then Aubrey herself is either deeply compromised or dangerously negligent." "She told me she wanted to fix it," I said, my voice breaking with disbelief. Alina's gaze softened. "Maybe she does, but even if she does, that does not erase her role in what happened. Sometimes good intentions and bad decisions live in the same person." I stared at the documents, my hands trembling. For months I had been building this case against Damien. For months I had thought he was the monster at the center. But now I saw him for what he was: a shield, a weapon, a pawn in a game that stretched far beyond him. The real enemy was not a man. It was a system. The next day, Aubrey called me into her office. Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed a storm beneath. She gestured for me to sit. "I want to be transparent with you, Callie," she said. "The investigation has revealed documents that bear my signature. I want you to hear directly from me. I never authorized those transfers knowingly. My signature may have been applied without my knowledge or buried in stacks of approvals I was pushed to sign under pressure. But I want you to understand, I am not your enemy." I searched her face, looking for cracks in the mask. "Then who is?" I asked. Her silence was telling. She did not know, or she did not want to say. When I left her office, I realized the twist had shifted the ground beneath me completely. This was no longer about Damien. It was about the rot at the very heart of the company, and if I kept going, I would no longer be fighting a man. I would be fighting an empire. The illusion of victory is often more dangerous than defeat. When Damien was gone and whispers filled the halls about executive misconduct, people began to believe the storm was ending. But storms do not end so easily. They shift, they gather force, and sometimes they come back stronger than before. I could feel it in the building. On the surface, things looked calmer. HR sent cheerful emails about transparency and reform. Executives held brief town halls about integrity and accountability. People smiled more in the hallways as if they wanted to believe the worst was over. But beneath the surface, something darker moved. The investigation had pulled open a wound, and the company was scrambling to cover it. Thea noticed it too. He sat across from me in the cafeteria one afternoon, lowering his voice. "They are redacting documents before the investigators can see them. I overheard finance talking about files disappearing from the system." My stomach tightened. "Disappearing." "Gone," he said grimly. "Backups too. I think someone is deliberately scrubbing records." The words ignited something inside me. For months I had been building my defense, reacting to Damien's moves, documenting every cut and insult. But now the fight had changed. If they were destroying evidence, they were admitting guilt. And if they thought they could erase the truth, they had underestimated me. That night, I returned to my apartment and opened my encrypted archives. Every file, every recording, every note I had gathered was still safe. I had made too many redundancies, hidden too many backups. They could burn their own records to ash, but they could not touch mine. Still, I knew my files alone would not be enough. They needed voices, witnesses, proof that lived in people, not just in paper. The next morning, I pulled Theo aside. "If they are scrubbing records, then it is time for us to speak louder. You have proof. Others do too. We need to bring it together." His face went pale. "You mean form an alliance?" "I mean stop whispering in hallways and start speaking as one," I said. "They can silence individuals. They cannot silence a group." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I will reach out to Marian. She is tired of hiding too." By the end of the week, 3 more colleagues had joined us. We met in quiet corners, in coffee shops away from the office, trading stories, comparing notes. Each of us carried pieces of the puzzle. Put together, they revealed a pattern too large to ignore. It was during one of those meetings that Marian leaned forward and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "One of the contracts you flagged, Callie, I checked the vendors against our internal directory. Do you know who owns them?" I shook my head. She slid a sheet of paper toward me. On it was a tangled ownership structure that ended with a name I recognized instantly: Aubrey's brother. I stared at the page, my pulse hammering. "Are you certain?" Marian nodded. "The shell companies all trace back to him. He has been profiting from inflated contracts for years. And the signatures on those approvals, including Aubrey's, all link directly to those companies." The illusion cracked again, sharper this time. Aubrey, the woman who had looked me in the eye and promised she wanted to fix everything, had been protecting her own blood. That night, I confronted Alina with the discovery. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable before finally saying, "This is the heart of it. Damien was a distraction. The CFO was a shield. But this ties everything back to the top. If you expose this, Callie, you will not just be challenging an executive, you will be challenging the founder herself." Her words sat between us like a blade. I thought of Aubrey's face during the all-hands meeting, the way her gratitude seemed genuine. I thought of her private words to me, her insistence that she was not my enemy. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she told herself she was protecting the company, but the paper in my hand told a different story. The next morning, when I walked into the building, the atmosphere was different again. Tighter, more guarded, executives clustered in corners, their voices hushed. HR representatives moved through the halls with forced smiles. The company was bracing itself, but for what I could not yet tell. In my pocket, the paper with Aubrey's brother's name burned like a secret too dangerous to keep. I realized then that the illusion of reform was breaking. The real fight was only beginning, and if I wanted to win, I could no longer play defense. I had to go on the attack. The decision to go on the attack did not come all at once. It grew inside me like a slow fire, fed by every lie I had heard, every document scrubbed from the servers, every colleague too afraid to speak. By the time I held Marion's discovery in my hands, the choice was no longer if but when. The first step was gathering strength. We could not fight as scattered individuals, each clutching fragments of truth. We needed unity. I reached out to Theo, Marion, and 2 others who had whispered their own stories in the shadows. We met one evening in my apartment, the city humming outside the window, stacks of papers spread across my coffee table. "This is bigger than Damien," I told them. "Bigger than the CFO. The trail leads to Aubrey's family. If we stop now, they will bury this. If we push, we might burn the whole structure down." Silence filled the room. Theo leaned forward, his voice steady. "If we burn it down, what happens to us? Maybe we lose our jobs," I said honestly. "Maybe we get blacklisted. Maybe we never work in this industry again. But if we stay silent, then nothing changes. They win, and they keep winning. Do you really want to go back to that?" Marion shook her head slowly. "I cannot, not anymore." One by one, they nodded. It was fragile unity, but it was real. The second step was strategy. I worked with Alina late into the night, laying out our evidence, connecting every piece until the web stretched clear. She was careful, cautious, but she never tried to dissuade me. Instead, she sharpened me, asking hard questions, forcing me to anticipate every move the company might make. "They will threaten you," she said. "They will paint you as unstable, disloyal, vindictive. They will offer settlements that seem impossible to refuse. And if that fails, they may come after your credibility in ways you cannot yet imagine. Are you ready for that?" I looked her in the eye. "I have been ready since the day Damien told me to drop it. He underestimated me then. They will all underestimate me now." She smiled faintly, pride flickering in her eyes. "Then let us make them regret it." The next morning, I made my move. Instead of staying quiet, I walked straight to the investigators' temporary office and placed the ownership documents on their desk. "These companies belong to Aubrey Ravenholm's brother," I said, "and every one of these contracts was approved by the CFO, sometimes co-signed by Aubrey herself. If you want to know where the money is going, start here." Their faces shifted, professionalism cracking under the weight of what I had just handed them. Calder looked at me with something close to alarm. "Do you understand the scale of this, Ms. Fox?" "Yes," I said. "Better than anyone. That is why you cannot ignore it." The room was silent as they studied the papers. Finally, Calder nodded. "We will verify this, but if it is true, it is true," I cut in. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled slightly at my sides. "And you need to act before they bury it." By the end of the week, the cracks in the illusion were impossible to ignore. Whispers spread through the office like wildfire. Executives moved behind closed doors for hours at a time. IT staff muttered about sudden, unexplained orders to purge old backups. HR sent vague memos about structural transitions. And then Aubrey called another meeting. This time, her composure was brittle, her voice taut with strain. "The investigation is ongoing," she announced to the assembled staff. "We are cooperating fully. I want to assure you that Beckworth Dynamics remains committed to integrity." But her eyes found mine again, sharp and searching, and I saw what she could not admit aloud. She knew I had pushed the investigators toward her family. She knew the truth was creeping closer. After the meeting, she pulled me aside into her office. The door closed behind us with a soft click. "You are playing a dangerous game, Callie," she said quietly. "I am not the one who built the game," I replied. "I am only refusing to lose it." Her mask slipped then, just for an instant. Frustration flickered across her features, chased by something else, fear. Do you really think exposing my brother will save this company? Do you think tearing me down will make you the hero? This was never about being a hero, I said. It was about the truth, and the truth does not care who it burns. For a moment, I thought she might break, that she might admit everything. But then the mask returned. She straightened her posture, her voice smooth again. Be careful, Ms. Fox. Sometimes the truth destroys more than lies ever could. I left her office with her warning echoing in my ears, but instead of fear, I felt clarity. She was not untouchable anymore. She was already on the defensive. That night, my allies gathered again. We sat around my table, maps of documents spread before us, and I told them what Aubrey had said. She is afraid, I told them. That means we are close. Theo exhaled slowly. So what is our next move? I looked around the room at the faces of those who had risked everything to stand beside me. For months I had carried this fight alone, but not anymore. The silence was broken. The shadows were thinning. Our next move, I said, is to take this beyond them, beyond the company. If they want to bury the truth, then we go public. The words hung in the air, heavy with risk, but no one objected. The illusion was broken. The only path left was through the fire. The decision to go public was not one I made lightly. For months I had fought this war in silence, behind glass walls and encrypted files. To step beyond those walls meant exposing not only the company, but myself. It meant becoming more than a witness. It meant becoming the face of dissent, but silence was no longer an option. They were scrubbing records, locking doors, moving money through invisible channels. The illusion of reform was crumbling, and I knew if we hesitated even a little longer, they would bury the truth under layers of corporate spin. I met Alina late one night in her office. She was surrounded by stacks of folders, her eyes tired but burning with determination. Are you absolutely certain? She asked, studying me across the desk. Once we take this outside, there is no going back. They will come after you harder than ever. I nodded. They already have. What difference does it make if they sharpen their knives? Her lips curved into a faint smile. Good, then we move. The plan was simple in outline but dangerous in execution. We would compile a dossier, a single unshakable package of evidence, vendor contracts tied to Aubrey's brother, executive approvals, testimonies from employees who had endured Damien's abuse. Once complete, we would deliver it to both regulatory authorities and the press. Theo, Marion, and the others gathered at my apartment the following evening. The table groaned under the weight of paper and laptops, each of us working late into the night. The air was electric, a mixture of fear and resolve. We need airtight connections, Theo muttered, typing furiously. If even one thread is weak, they will tear the whole case apart. We make it unterrible, I said. Every number, every signature, every voice, they cannot silence all of us. Marion glanced up from her notes. You know what this means, right? Once this goes public, there is no protection left. Settlements, confidentiality, gone. They will fight with everything they have. Then let them, I said. My voice surprised even me with its steadiness. I am done hiding. We worked until dawn, piecing together months of fragments into a single story. A story not of one bad manager, but of a culture built on exploitation and greed. Each page tightened the net, each testimony added weight. By sunrise, the dossier was thick enough to crush a career, thick enough to crack an empire. The first move came from Aubrey. She called me into her office the next day, her tone deceptively calm. Callie, she said, I know you have been speaking with others. I know you are building something, but I need you to understand the consequences. If you drag this company through the mud, thousands of people could lose their jobs. Investors will pull out. Entire departments could collapse. Is that the legacy you want? Her words were sharp, but I heard the fear beneath them. She was not warning me for the company's sake. She was warning me for her own. You should have thought of that before your brother signed those contracts, I replied. For the first time, her mask slipped entirely. Her jaw clenched, her eyes flashing. You don't know what you are talking about. Yes, I said softly, I do, and soon so will everyone else. I left her office without waiting for her reply. That night, we finalized the dossier. Alina double-checked the legal citations. Theo encrypted the files for secure transfer. Marion formatted the testimonies into clear, concise statements. When it was done, I stared at the thick folder on the table and felt both terrified and alive. This is it, Alina said quietly. Once it leaves our hands, there is no taking it back. I touched the folder, my fingers trembling. Then let's send it. We delivered copies to the Regulatory Commission and to 3 major news outlets. And then we waited. The waiting was worse than the building. Days passed in a haze of tension. Colleagues whispered that external auditors had arrived. Executives vanished into meetings. Rumors spread like wildfire that the CFO had resigned, that Aubrey was under investigation, that Damien had surfaced again with his own accusations. And then the story broke. Headlines splashed across the news. Beckworth Dynamics under investigation for fraud and hostile workplace practices. Articles detailed inflated contracts, conflicts of interest, patterns of abuse. My name appeared in the first paragraphs, quoted as the whistleblower who had refused to stay silent. The storm hit instantly. Phones rang nonstop. Journalists camped outside the building. Investors demanded answers. Employees flooded internal channels with messages of support, anger, confusion. The company had tried to contain the fire, but now it raged in the open. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the weight of eyes. Colleagues stared at me in hallways, some with gratitude, others with resentment. To them, I was either the woman who had saved them or the woman who had doomed them, and in the center of it all stood Aubrey. She called a press conference 2 days later. Standing before cameras, she delivered a polished statement of shock and disappointment, promising full cooperation, promising reforms. She painted Damien as a rogue manager, the CFO as a corrupt outlier. But when questions turned to her brother, she faltered. The reporters pressed harder, asking about the shell companies, the signatures, the ties that could not be ignored. And in that moment, I saw the crack in her armor. The mask she had worn for years began to slip, just enough for the world to glimpse the truth. But even as the world began to turn against her, I knew this was not the end. There was still something deeper, something Damien had hinted at in that hotel bar. He had said he was just the scapegoat, that someone else had built the machine. And now, as I watched Aubrey's mask tremble under the glare of the cameras, I began to wonder, had she been orchestrating all of it from the beginning? The press conference should have buried Aubrey. Instead, it left the air thick with questions. She had tried to perform control, tried to play the role of the betrayed leader, shocked by corruption around her. For some, it worked. Investors clung to her assurances like a lifeline. Employees wanted to believe the founder they admired was still intact. But I had seen the flicker in her eyes when they asked about her brother. That flicker told me everything. That evening, Theo texted me, "You need to see this. Urgent." We met in a deserted parking structure, the kind of place where voices echoed off concrete and shadows swallowed the corners. He looked rattled, his laptop bag slung over one shoulder. Without a word, he pulled out his computer and showed me files he had copied before the purge. "These are internal memos," he said, his voice shaking. "Communications between Aubrey and the CFO. They go back 3 years. She was approving the structures, not reluctantly, not accidentally. Strategically, she knew everything." I scrolled through the emails, my chest tightening with each line. Aubrey's words were clear, instructions to consolidate vendor contracts, to route them through the shell companies, to maximize discrete returns. There was no ambiguity. This was not negligence. This was orchestration. My stomach turned cold. "She built it," I whispered. Theo nodded grimly. Damien wasn't running the show, he was just the blunt instrument. The CFO handled the numbers, and Aubrey, she directed it all. It was the twist I had dreaded, the truth Damien had tried to warn me of in that hotel bar. He had been the sacrifice. The brother had been the smokescreen. But the real architect of the machine was the woman at the top, the one who had looked me in the eye and told me she wanted reform. I carried the files straight to Alina. She read them in silence, her expression darkening by the second. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharp as glass. "This changes everything," she said. "These aren't just incriminating, they are devastating. If this goes public, Aubrey Ravenholm is finished." "She already should be finished," I snapped. "She lied to me, she lied to everyone." Alina leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Lying is the least of it. This is fraud on a scale that could bring criminal charges. We are not talking about settlements anymore. We are talking about prison." The weight of her words hit me like a stone. For months, I had fought to reclaim my dignity, to expose a corrupt manager, to survive a hostile workplace. Now I was staring at the collapse of an empire and the destruction of the woman who had built it. The next day, I returned to the office knowing everything had changed. Whispers followed me through the halls. People had read the headlines, watched the press conference, felt the tremors in the walls. Some looked at me with gratitude, others with resentment, but all of them knew the center was breaking. Aubrey summoned me to her office in the afternoon. Her assistant's voice was tight when she said, "She insists." I walked in to find Aubrey standing by the window, the city stretched behind her in sharp lines of glass and steel. She turned when the door closed, her eyes burning with a mix of fury and something that looked almost like desperation. "You think you have won," she said, Her voice was low, cold. I said nothing. I only waited. You think those scraps of paper, those memos, prove anything? Do you know how easy it is to make a signature disappear? Do you know how many board members would rather bury this than see me fall? You are naive, Callie. Brave, yes, but naive. My heart pounded, but I held her gaze. You built this. Damien was your pawn, your brother was your cover, and now you are trying to turn me into your scapegoat. Her smile was thin, bitter. Scapegoats are necessary. I gave Damien power because he was ambitious enough to burn himself. I let my brother benefit because family is leverage. And you, I underestimated you. I thought you would fold like all the others, but instead you became something useful. Useful? I spat. You gave me credibility, she said. The heroic employee who spoke truth to power. The press loves you. The employees rally behind you. And while they are focused on Damien and the CFO, while they are dazzled by your courage, the real structure remains untouched. That was the plan. That is always the plan. Her words were knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. For a moment I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Had I been playing into her hands all along? But then I remembered Theo's files, the emails, the memos with her own words. I remembered the allies who had risked everything to stand with me, and I realized something she had not accounted for. You made one mistake, I said, my voice steady. Her brows arched. And what is that? You left a trail, I said. And this time the trail doesn't disappear. It multiplies. It lives in the hands of too many people now. You cannot bury it anymore. For the first time, I saw real fear flicker in her eyes. I left her office without another word. Outside, the building hummed with tension, employees moving like shadows under storm clouds. But inside me, the fire burned steady. Aubrey had built her empire on illusions, on control, on scapegoats and silence. But the illusion was shattered. And I would not stop until every hidden piece of her machine was dragged into the light. The fall of an empire does not happen in silence. It happens with a roar that shakes every wall, every desk, every voice that once whispered in the shadows. The news spread faster than even I imagined. Within days of Theo's files being verified by the investigators, headlines blazed across the country. Fraud at the top of Beckworth Dynamics. Founder linked to corrupt vendor network. Reporters tore into every detail, piecing together the web of shell companies, inflated contracts, and the names that signed them into existence. For years, Aubrey Ravenholm had been untouchable. Now her name was printed beside words like scandal, fraud, indictment. Inside the company, chaos reigned. Executives scrambled to distance themselves, issuing hollow statements about limited knowledge and misplaced trust. Board members who once smiled at Aubrey in every quarterly meeting now refused to take her calls. Departments froze mid-project, unsure if funding would survive the week. The cafeteria buzzed with rumors, speculation, fear. And through it all, I walked the halls with a strange, quiet clarity. Theo caught up with me one afternoon, his expression a mixture of exhilaration and dread. "She's finished," he whispered. "They're talking about federal charges. This could bring the whole company down." "Maybe it should," I said softly. He stared at me as if weighing whether to argue. Then he shook his head. "You're right, but I never thought I'd live to see it." Marion stopped by my desk later that day. She placed a coffee cup in front of me and said, "Thank you." Her eyes shimmered, her voice low. "For all of us who couldn't speak, you spoke." I didn't know how to respond. Gratitude was harder to hold than anger. Meanwhile, Aubrey fought. She hired new lawyers, issued defiant statements, insisted she was innocent. She claimed her brother had manipulated her signature, that Damien and the CFO had acted without her knowledge. But the emails told a different story, and the investigators were relentless. The final fracture came when a board member leaked transcripts of private calls between Aubrey and the CFO. In them, her voice was unmistakable, discussing discrete returns and shielding the balance sheets. The mask was gone. The world heard her clearly. The day she resigned, the office felt like the air after a thunderstorm, heavy, electric, but alive. People gathered in small groups, whispering, laughing nervously, some even crying. For so long, she had been the center of everything. Now she was gone, but victory was not clean. The company bled, shares plummeted, projects collapsed. Hundreds of employees worried for their futures. And in the middle of it all, I had to face the question I had been avoiding. What did I want now? Elena asked me directly over coffee. "You've done what most people never could. You exposed the rod at the very top. But the fight has cost you months of your life, your health, your peace. So what now, Callie?" I stared into the dark surface of my drink. "I don't know," I admitted. "Yes, you do," she said gently. "You've always known, you just have to say it." At night, in the quiet of my apartment, I let myself think about it. I thought about my father's workshop, about the smell of solder and the sound of his steady voice reminding me that every broken system can be rebuilt. I thought about the girl I once was, hunched over notebooks, hungry for patterns, searching for meaning in chaos. And I thought about the woman I had become, standing against giants and refusing to bend. I realized then that I no longer wanted to belong to a system like Beckworth Dynamics. I wanted to build something different, something honest. The idea scared me as much as it thrilled me, but for the first time in months, the fear did not feel like a weight. It felt like wings. I shared the thought with Theo and Marion one evening as we packed away the last of our files. What if, I said slowly, we started something new, a consultancy, independent, a place where truth isn't punished but rewarded, where numbers serve people, not the other way around. Theo's eyes lit with something I hadn't seen in him before. Hope. You mean us, together? Why not? I said. We've already proven we can fight the system. Now let's build one that works. Marion smiled, tired but bright. I would follow you, Callie, anywhere. It wasn't a decision, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. And as the sun set outside the window, painting the sky in streaks of fire, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just survival, not just victory, possibility. The collapse of Beckworth Dynamics unfolded like an avalanche, sudden, unstoppable, devastating. Within weeks of Aubrey's resignation, lawsuits piled up. Regulators froze accounts. Vendors cut ties. Clients withdrew contracts. What had once been a towering empire of glass and steel crumbled into shards, each headline driving the point deeper. The giant had fallen, and with its fall came reckoning. Damien resurfaced, trying to claw back relevance. He granted interviews, painting himself as a pawn, as the man who had taken orders and been discarded. For once, he was telling the truth, though not the whole of it. People listened, but no one trusted him anymore. He had burned too many bridges, left too many scars. He was not redeemed. He was simply exposed. The CFO vanished from public view, his reputation annihilated by the numbers he once manipulated so deftly. Rumor said he fled the country. Others whispered he was negotiating a deal with prosecutors. I didn't care. His absence was its own confession. And Aubrey, the woman who had once seemed untouchable, now faced the justice she had thought she could outrun. Photos of her leaving court in a dark suit circulated everywhere, her face pale, her composure cracked. For years she had built illusions of power, wrapped in charisma and vision. Now the world saw her as she truly was, fragile, fallible, corrupt. Some employees mourned her fall. Others cheered it, most simply tried to survive the wreckage. Departments were cut, projects dissolved, dreams abandoned. For many, the company had been more than work, it had been identity. Now that identity was gone, and in the middle of it all, I stood at a crossroads. For months, survival had been my compass. Each day was about enduring, about gathering, about refusing to break. But now the storm had passed. The fight was over, and survival was no longer enough. One afternoon, as the last boxes were carried out of the office, I lingered at my old desk. The chair was empty, the computer shut down, the papers gone. Just a space now, a hollow where months of my life had played out. Theo joined me, leaning against the doorway. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said softly. "Like a ghost town," I replied. He smiled faintly. "So, what next? Do we scatter, start over somewhere else, pretend this never happened?" I shook my head. "We don't scatter, we rebuild." "Together?" He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Then count me in." Later that evening, we met with Marion at a small cafe far from downtown. We sat at a corner table, sketching ideas on napkins, our laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes and the hum of strangers' conversations. For the first time in months, the air felt light. "We call it something honest," Marion said, scribbling names. "Something that reminds us why we started. Not just survival," I added. "Accountability, transparency, a place where truth has weight." We didn't have answers yet, only questions, only beginnings, but beginnings were enough. Elena visited a few nights later, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that seemed both proud and tired. She raised her glass to me across my cluttered kitchen table. "To the woman who refused to be silenced." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I didn't do it alone." "No one ever does," she said. Her eyes held mine. "But you lit the fire." And because of that, everything changed. Her words stayed with me. In quiet moments when the city was still, I thought of the girl I once was, the girl who saw patterns in notebooks, who refused to accept half-answers, who wanted to believe that systems could be fixed. That girl had grown into a woman who had walked through fire and come out scarred but unbroken. The world would remember Aubrey's empire as a cautionary tale, but I would remember it as something else, the crucible where I was remade. In the end, I chose not to carry bitterness, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved freedom. Hatred chains you as tightly as fear, and I had no intention of being chained again. One evening, standing on my balcony, the city spread out beneath me in glittering light, I whispered the words I had been waiting to say for months. It's over. And then, with a breath that felt like wings opening, I added, it's just beginning. Because endings are never truly endings. They are transformations. The fire burns, the empire falls, and from the ashes something new rises. And I, Callie Fox, was ready to rise.